Okay, ready? Excuse me. Now we go back or conference. We start official conference now.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Boston Global Forum's G7 Summit Initiative Conference. I'm Mike Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, chairman of the Boston Global Forum. I want to acknowledge, as I always do at these conferences of ours, the important role that Twine Nguyen has played in helping to create this. He was the person that had this idea, put it together, and has really been the organizational cement in all of this. So Twine, to you, a special thank you again for bringing us together and creating the forum. We in the Boston Global Forum, over the course of the past few years, have discussed many international issues that will be taken up by the national leaders of the G7 Summit on May 26th and 27th in Japan. But our focus has been on crafting recommendations to the leaders for improving international cybersecurity in particular, and cyber behavior in general. We call our overall campaign Building Ethics Norms for Cyber Behavior. To advance that program, our Boston Global Forum experts have crafted an ethics code of conduct for cyber peace and security, which we have just renamed the Ise-Shima Norms after the beautiful area in Japan where the summit will be held. You can read details about this on the Boston Global Forum's website and our handouts today for those of us who are joining together here in Cambridge. Boston Global Forum has been working with Japanese officials as well involved in planning the summit to describe the G7 leaders the Ise-Shima Norms and the Boston Global Forum's broader efforts to improve cybersecurity and create ethical norms in this evolving field of technology. We're indebted to the hard work of the Boston Global Forum G7 Summit Committee and the many experts, some of whom are with us here today in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who have participated in our online dialogues, mostly involving cybersecurity over the course of the past few months. We also want to thank the Japanese government and non-government experts who have worked closely with us to develop proposals for national leaders to consider on May 26th and 27th in Japan. A list of all of these good people and their impressive credentials may be found on the Boston Global Forum website, bostonglobalforum.org. Now we're going to divide our conference this evening into two sessions. First, we're going to focus on the proposed cyber behavior norms, and then secondly, we'll discuss other aspects of the summit, as well as certain Japanese issues which we will discuss with our friends in Japan. So we hope that you will enjoy our conference today, and obviously hope it will have a significant impact on what we hope will be an evolving code of conduct that nations will observe as we try to deal with both the great asset of information technology and some of the problems that it brings with it. This is always the case. Now we're going to begin with a film statement from Professor José Barroso, the former Prime Minister of Portugal and the former President of the European Commission, and then we're going to ask two of our experts here, Professor John Savage, Professor Derek Reveron, to speak with us as well. Then we'll have some additional film segments, we'll have a roundtable discussion, and then I hope we're going to have some time to invite hundreds of folks who are participating in this conference from all over the world to participate as well. So we have much to do. Special thanks to those of you who are joining us here. Thanks to those who will be joining us elsewhere and to the public in general. So let's begin, if we can, with Professor Barroso's statement, And it was nice enough to prepare this on film, and we will show it now.
I welcome the Boston Global Forum initiative on the G7. I wish all the best for that meeting. Unfortunately, because of previous commitments, I will not be able to participate. But I've been formally in contact with the participants, and I know they have been preparing very good work. It can be a very interesting input for the G7 summit in Japan. What can we say about the G7? I've been all these years participating in the G7 and the G8 meetings since 2004, during the 10 years I was leading the European Commission. My experience of this format is indeed a very positive one, because you have there the leaders of the 7 very important countries in the world, together with the European Union, discussing in a very deep manner the most important issues in the global economic and political agenda. This meeting this year in Japan comes, of course, at a very important moment. We are still seeing signs of some concern regarding the global economy. We are seeing an unprecedented situation of monetary injection, at the same time some retraction in terms of investment, and also concerns about the lack of consumer and investor confidence, namely in the more mature economies. So I believe it will be important to have a common approach in this G7 meeting in Japan on support for growth, sustained growth. If all economies that are represented by the leaders in the G7 summit commit to consensual approach on this matter, it will certainly be good news for the global economy. But there are other concerns beyond the economy. And in fact, some geopolitical concerns may have some kind of impact in the current economic mood. Global threats like national terrorism, Muslim fundamentalism, they are that's very bad news. The consequences of the conflicts in some areas, namely the Middle East, Syria conflict, and I believe it will be important to have a clear statement of the G7 about those matters. In Europe, besides the Syria crisis, the terrorism threat, the impact in terms of refugees that is putting pressure in some of our countries, there is also a concern about the actions of Russia, namely about their actions concerning Ukraine. I believe it is important to have a frank and open discussion among leaders in this G7 summit. And of course, there is now a very new kind of challenge and threat. It is the issue of cyber attacks. And so I think it is important that the world be serious tackling that challenge and that threat of cyber security. It's a new kind of threat, and for a new kind of threat we need new instruments. I personally believe that it will be important that the leaders of G7 agree on a common approach, possibly a binding, global binding approach based in international law, so that they can also ask others to join, because this is something that has had an impact, sometimes in economic sentiment, but also in the overall feeling or perception of security or insecurity. So I really hope that the G7 in Japan makes progress in these and other areas. And from my personal experience participating in so many of these G7 or G8 meetings, I can tell you that's a very adequate forum for having really intimate, sometimes some level of competitive meetings where leaders can during some days very openly discuss issues, and of course afterwards agree on some positions. So this is important to talk because that is the best way to achieve convergence. I wish all the best for the G7 in Japan. I welcome the Boston Global Forum meeting, and I wish all the best for that meeting. Unfortunately, because of previous commitments, I cannot participate, but I'm well informed about the preparation of that meeting and about the quality of work done, for instance, in the field of cyber security. So let me send my best wishes for the success of the Boston Global Forum.
The sound?
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Grosso. Okay, now we're going to begin our program here in Cambridge. And I'm going to ask two of our guests and participants to address us first. We'll begin with Professor John Savage, who's the Anne Wang Professor of Computer Science at Brown University, and we'll follow him with Professor Derek Reverend, who's the Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval War College. And welcome both of you, and I'm delighted that you're making my choice. Thanks, John.
It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. My role is to offer a welcome from the Boston Global Forum, and then to provide input to the agenda for the G7 Ise-Shima Summit. As you know, the three items on the agenda for this meeting are global economy, trade development, quality infrastructure, trade and development, and quality infrastructure investment. Given the importance of the internet in all three areas, we encourage you to address the following actions concerning cybersecurity at the summit. These actions have as their goal to raise the general level of security in cyberspace. So I'm going to read out these proposals, after which I'll discuss them. The first is to encourage the global adoption of the 2015 G20 cybersecurity norms, which include the 2015 Government Group of Expert norms by reference. The second is that we encourage you to endorse private and public efforts to improve the ethical internet behavior. The UCLA Global Citizenship Education Program and the Boston Global Forum's Ethical Code of Conduct for Cyber Peace and Security, known as ECC, are two such examples. We would encourage you to combine these norms and refer to them as the Ise-Shima norms. Our third recommendation is that you engage vendors of cyberspace technology in the discussion of norms for responsible state behavior. Our fourth recommendation suggests that you establish domestic and international centers and mechanisms designed to reduce the risk of cyber conflict. The fifth proposal is to encourage national cybersecurity experts to voluntarily publicize their best security practices. And the sixth and final recommendation is that you recognize that formulation of policy concerning cyberspace technologies requires the participation on an equal footing of respected academics and industry experts on the technologies in question. Now let me elaborate on these. First, over the last 5 years, small groups of governments have formulated international norms of state behavior, particularly for peacetime use, as Joe Nye has observed. Negotiations have been held at the UN and in many other fora. Now that a set of reasonable norms have been established, it is appropriate to reach out to nations that have not participated in these discussions and encourage them to endorse them as well. For example, I'm going to read to you one norm from the G20 norms, which states intellectual property theft for commercial purposes. This is not only a G20 norm, but it was one of the norms that was negotiated between Presidents Xi and Obama. A GGE norm is as follows. No country should intentionally damage the critical infrastructure of another state or impair infrastructure that serves the public and would undermine the human rights guaranteed by the UN Declaration. In pursuing these norms, in many cases, encouraging the adoption by other states, this will require some capacity development, which is encouraged by UN Resolution 70/237. The G7 nations can help increase confidence in computers and network technology by leading this effort, which could also be called the Ise Shima Challenge. Second, global citizenship education has an important role to play in building a sustainable peace and security in cyberspace. We encourage a significant effort in this regard. And in particular, the ECCC norms that the Boston Global Forum has formulated would be appropriate to incorporate here. Third, we observe that the success of many computer vendors requires that their customers have confidence in their products, which is undermined by unreported cyber vulnerabilities and by state-launched weapons that result in mass events. Thus, some vendors, notably Microsoft, have begun to formulate and promulgate norms of state behavior that are important from their point of view. And I would like to read to you two of Microsoft's 6 proposed norms. Countries should exercise restraint in developing cyber weapons and should ensure that any which are developed are limited, precise, and not reusable. And the second norm I'm going to read to you says, countries should assist private sector efforts to detect, contain, respond to, and recover from events in cyberspace. States should take these nascent efforts on part of vendors seriously and engage these firms in norms formulation. Fourth, given the large number of states that are developing cyber weapons, the risk of accidental or intentional cyber conflict is rising. All states should recognize this risk and work to mitigate it. Centers designed to reduce the risk of cyber conflict are needed in every country with offensive cyber capability. Operators in these centers must come to know each other so that they can properly assess national intentions during a cyber crisis. This issue has been highlighted in the latest 2015 GGE report. The fifth recommendation on best practices is illustrated by a public talk given in January of this year by Rob Joyce, head of NSA's Tailored Access Operations Department. He offered advice on cybersecurity measures to protect a computing facility from the type of penetration in which his department engages. This event was a remarkable example of the security services of a major nation, the U.S., offering constructive advice to others. Each G7 nation could assume the same responsibility for improving the security of cyberspace by offering such examples of best practices. Finally, policy formulation concerning cyberspace can be very challenging. Unless technology experts at the table with policymakers when such policy is formulated, errors are easily made that may lead to poorly formulated international norms or domestic legislation. Thus, it is essential that academic and technology experts be engaged and treated as co-equals with policymakers during this process. And now, Derek, you have the microphone.
Well, thank you, John. Governor Tuan, thank you very much for having me here this evening to share my personal views, not representative of the U.S. government or the Naval War College. But tonight I'd like to talk about cybersecurity deficits in international norms. International security for the last 30 years has been characterized by security deficits, which I define as a government's inability to meet its national security obligations without external support. In the terrestrial world, intrastate, transnational, and regional actors challenge government's ability to provide a secure environment for their citizens. This means Iraq struggles against ISIS, the United States confronts transnational organized crime, and Ukraine struggles against Russia. While these conflicts are isolated in particular places in the world, the effect of security deficits are felt throughout their entire regions. G7 countries have been at the forefront of peace efforts to alleviate problems created by international crises like these. They also provide development and security assistance to weakened governments in an effort to improve stability, strengthen institutions, and protect vulnerable populations. The rationale to assist countries in overcoming their security deficits has been based on the assumption that instability breeds chaos, which would make it more likely that the international community would face pressure to intervene in the future, often at higher costs in lives and resources. The same is true in the cyber world. Transnational organized criminal groups harness the power of the internet to steal identity and conduct financial crimes. Terrorist organizations use cyberspace to recruit fighters and promote their destructive deeds. And countries employ cyber tools for espionage while laying the groundwork for military operations in cyberspace. Cyber challenges like these cut across all dimensions. They're political, economic, and social. More than ever, citizens, regardless of nationality, are exposed to risks created by cyber insecurity. Reinforced by intelligence assessments, polling in the United States places cyber insecurity as a pressing national security challenge. With persistent vulnerabilities in the software we use and relative impunity with which states, groups, and individuals operate in cyberspace, we will continue to experience data breaches, leading to fraud and intellectual property theft, undercutting innovation. Governments, organizations, companies, and individuals can be overmatched by malicious actors. Cybersecurity deficits undercut the benefits citizens derive from the technology we enjoy, and directly affect individuals in ways that past conflicts in distant parts of the world have not affected G7 countries. At the same time, disclosures about governments' roles in cyberspace undermine trust and challenge credibility. Information technology companies are pressured to enable governments special access to their products, all the while attempting to comply with different national regulations. Citizens are stuck in the middle, feeling that the promises of an open, transparent, and secure cyberspace look bleak. At the national security level, governments are concerned with cyber-Armageddon scenarios against critical public infrastructure, disabling electricity, telecommunications, and financial services. While cyber-Armageddon is not inevitable and represents more of a wake-up call about cyber insecurity rather than an existential threat, critical sectors have huge incentives to secure their own infrastructure. However, as we've seen in other areas, security becomes a cat and mouse game where malicious actors improve rapidly, often outpacing governments' abilities to adapt or defend against emerging threats. This shared insecurity need not be paralyzing, but can be a basis for international cooperation in which G7 countries have important roles to play. Building on the norms that my colleague John Savage outlined, the next steps to improve cyber insecurity include convening sub-regional summits to outline the scope of cybersecurity challenges and improve multilateral efforts to promulgate norms. establishing information sharing centers where governments can share threat information, coordinate cybersecurity policies, and implement best practices for governments, organizations, companies, and individuals. And assisting governments in developing countries to strengthen their government networks, improve protection of critical public infrastructure, and educate citizens to raise their security posture, improving human capital. As we all know, there are no borders in cyberspace, and our networks are only as strong as the weakest access point. By promoting cybersecurity norms, enabling cooperation among G7 countries, and assisting developing countries, we will become more secure from actors that place individuals at the forefront of the cybersecurity threat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Speaking as a proud American, I think it's important that we all understand that a lot of countries are involved in this, including the United States. I mean, we've been breaking into other statesmen's email. We were involved in Stuxnet and others. So nobody is without sin here. I think that's an important thing to recognize. It's one of the reasons why it's so important that the international agreement and the observance of these norms. And we're very proud of the fact that we here at Boston Global Forum are playing an important role, I hope, in doing it. We're now going to have some short statements, some filmed, some in person, from Professor Joe Nye, who's been an important part of this forum, who's not able to be with us tonight. Professor Nazmi Choudhury, who was with us, is Professor of Political Science at MIT. Timoni Ignata, Chair of the Policy Research Council of the Liberal Democratic Party, and a member of the Japanese House of Representatives. Ryan Ness, my colleague here at Northeastern, and a research fellow in Security and Resilience Studies at Northeastern, and my good friend Tsutomu, he may have been known as Tom, or Tommy, who is the Consul General of Japan here in Boston. So let's begin with a film statement by Professor Nye. We can move into the center of this picture here. And he's, of course, with our founding fathers.
Imagine that you may have something like 20 or 30 billion connections to the internet over, and that enormously expands the attack surface's potential there. So we're going to see more of this, and I think it's time, and I applaud the Boston Global Forum for taking this as a topic to try to promote the more general understanding of norms related to cybersecurity. So let me stop there and say that I think this is an auspicious moment for our topic.
Thank you so much, Professor Truman. You mentioned that the norms, international norms, we have the GGE, and we have G20, and Boston Global Forum developed Ethical Conduct of Cyber Business, the ECCC. So we recommend international norm or G7 summit. How we enforce signals in G7 summit accept the norms?
Well, I think the interesting question will be to ask why the government accept norms. And if they would accept norms if it's in their self-interest. And if states feel that that norms limit the amount of destruction and the amount of uncertainty that is now present in cyber conflict, they may be better to restrict themselves than to enter into an all-out conflict and use of cyber instruments. So I think the more that there's international discussion at bodies like the G7, the more you may develop a realization of states that it's in their self-interest to formulate and respect such norms.
G7 summit in Japan this see you think how Japan can play role in cybersecurity and G7 summit initiative?
Well, Japan has been an important member of the GG as well as the technical, as well as obviously a major player and now host of the G7. So the idea that Japan will be taking it more seriously, time to try to promote them is an important step forward.
And the last question, what the Global Forum G7 Summit initiative we announced and we what do you think? And you can advise how small countries can contribute and play influential role in the initiative.
Well, more and more countries are developing their cyber capacities, and in that sense, it's not enough just to have norms that apply to G7. They have to apply to much broader set of countries. And so becoming, getting such countries involved, I think is important. Vietnam is making important progress in this area, and I think there's many others countries, Iran is also developing considerable capabilities.
Thank you so much. Talk and inspire people to conference what the Global Forum G7 Summit initiative conference happen in
Well, I wish us well in developing these models.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Swan. And I want to emphasize again that Joe and I has been an enormously important part of this. We're really very grateful to him. He's been here as well as out there and really been enormously valuable to us. Okay, Professor Chukri. Come on up here and talk to us.
I'll talk to you. I'm a newcomer to this initiative, and I'm really delighted to be here. I've been asked to focus on some actions, some measures to move forward, assuming that there's an evolution of norms and this conversion of norms. What can be done at this time with the resources that we have? And what I'd like to do is focus on the infrastructure that we have, the institutions that we have, and I would say assets, and I won't raise liabilities, but I'd like to simply list 6 very specific types of activities through which we can begin to transmit the evolution of the norms and the content of the norms. So number 1 is to engage the various cyber-centered institutions, and I'll tell you what I mean in a moment, in support of cyber norms. These are entities that are fundamentally important to the operation of the global internet system, and most of us don't take them very seriously because they're not really very interesting, but they are fundamentally important. These are in place. They include, but are not limited to, the CERTs, and we've already come across the CERTs in some of the documentations. There are also the international exchange points that are dots on the map, but once you connect the dots and you transmit information through the dots, that might be very helpful. And then the certificate authorities, not the most effective or notable entities of the system, but these are examples of assets that are dormant for our purposes and can be mobilized. The second point is connected to this, and that is to utilize, if at all possible, the regional manifestations of those entities and help in order to transmit the meaning of norms and to facilitate the transmission and the diffusion of norms. Much of the discourse at the global level gets lost as you go down to the regional and the operation national state. Bear with me, I've got 4 more to go. Second, the third is to support confidence building measures, that goes without saying, but support collaborative confidence building measures targeted to the transmission and the understanding and the debate and the discussion over the norms. Then we have the issue of best practices. All of us, of course, support best practices, but it's important to recognize that best practices are moving targets, and we should treat them as moving targets, not as a checklist. And so we can provide incentives for expanding the trajectories, rates of growth of best practices. That might be also helpful. The fifth is develop ways to create public support. There may be public fear now, but transforming that fear into public support for cybersecurity norms, for good behavior, so to speak. Good behavior is not something the public really thinks about, certainly not in this area. And then finally, and I think is quite important, is to encourage the diffusion of the diffusion in non-Western languages and the kind of discourse that we're having now. The introduction of norms and norms discussion, norms of cybersecurity and cyberspace in languages that are not our common languages, but that represents the evolving demography of the world, and that is not one that is centered in the Western world. Voila, that's about as much as I have to tell you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to move back to film with Mr. Inada of the Japanese Parliament. And can we run that film now?
No.
I don't think someone will.
Inada. Right.
皆さん、こんにちは。私は自由民主党政調会長の稲田朋美です。自由民主党の政策の取りまとめの責任者をしております。まずは BGF G7 サミットイニシアチブのご盛会をお祝いいたします。今回の
Can you folks see those subtitles?
参加することができとても残念です。ビデオメッセージでの参加をお許しください。はじめに世界の平和と日本の役割についてお話をいたします。我が国を取り巻く安全保障環境は近年一層厳しさを増しております。例えば北朝鮮は今年に入ってから1月に核実験を行い、さらにはミサイルを我が国の近海に何発も発射をしております。そのうちの一つはノドンといって我が国を射程に入れた、まさしく我が国を攻撃するためのミサイルも発射をしております。さらにはその北朝鮮が若くて何をするのか予期できない、予測不可能な若き指導者が周りを粛清しつつ指導を聞いているということが大変懸念をしております。また中国はどんどんと軍事費を増大させています。この10年間で 3.7 倍、今や日本の防衛費の3.6 倍の軍事費を使って、例えば我が国との境界を接する東シナ海でどんどん建造物を建てておりますし、南シナ海でも埋め立てをし、実行棟を作って、軍事施設を作る。さらには尖閣諸島へどんどん砲線を入れていく。独自に東シナ海の防空識別区を設定をしておりますし、法ではなくて力で支配を広げているということは大変懸念がされます。こうした動向について今後も強い関心を持って注視しなければならないと思っております。そのためにも東アジア太平洋地域の抑止力、さらには日米同盟の強化がとても重要だと思っております。昨年4月、18年ぶりに新たな日米防衛協力のためのガイドラインの策定をいたしました。日米同盟の我が国の安全保障の基盤であるとともに、アジア太平洋地域の平和と安定、さらには世界の平和と安定のために極めて重要な指針ができた。そして昨年の9月に大きな議論の下で平和安全法制が成立をいたしました。これによって、例えば日本を守るために日本の自衛隊の艦船とともに行動しているアメリカの艦船が攻撃を受けたとき、今までであれば我が国は見て見ぬふりをしなければなりませんでしたが、今回の法律が制定したことによって我が国の艦船を守るのと同じように米国の艦船も守れる同盟国であれば当たり前のことができるようになりました。この平和安全法制の成立によって日本の国の安全、国民の命、平和な暮らしを守るとともに東アジア太平洋地域の安定、そして世界平和に貢献ができるというふうに考えております。我が国としてはしっかりと世界の平和と安定のためにも役割を果たしてまいりたいと思います。次にサイバーセキュリティについて日本の役割についてもお話をいたします。サイバーセキュリティは国家の危機管理、ひいては安全保障につながる極めて重要な問題です。複雑で多岐にわたるサイバーセキュリティの問題については積極的にリーダーシップを果たしていく必要があります。我が国では昨年5月に日本年金機構に対する事件が発生いたしました。その後、世界各国で様々なサイバー攻撃が発生をしていて、サイバー攻撃の脅威が世界中でますます大きくなりつつあります。我が国では昨年の9月にサイバーセキュリティ戦略を閣議決定をいたしました。サイバーの世界においても現実世界と同様、法の支配を確立する必要があり、国際的な法の支配の確立が急務だと思っております。G7 のプロセスにおいて4月の初めの外相会談、先週行われました情報通信大臣会合、エネルギー大臣会合においてもサイバーセキュリティの重要性と国際的な協調の必要性が述べられました。これらの議論を踏まえて5月26日からの伊勢志摩 G7 サミットでも安倍総理が強いリーダーシップを取り、サイバーセキュリティに関わる協力の重要性を世界に発信をすることを期待をいたしております。最後になりましたが、本日お集まりの皆様方のこれからますますのご活躍と本日の会合が世界の平和と安定と経済の繁栄につながることを強く記念いたしております。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Okay, Ryan, Dennis, Murray. Colleagues, please.
Thank you, Governor.
Just 1 minute.
Looks like we need some cybersecurity in the room here, right? Okay, I might as well get started here. So I was asked to basically talk for 6 minutes, and I thought I'd try to summarize my research program in about 6 minutes. So basically what I do is I collect data, and I take a macro view of what's happening in cyberspace in the international arena. So recent actions such as the OPM hack, such as the Ukrainian power grid hack, things like that, make it appear as if we were experiencing a really dangerous breakout trend in cyber conflict in the international arena. So we see many analysts, from pundits to government officials, framing these violations as representing an era of ever more sophisticated and dangerous cyber conflict, where this could escalate into the conventional realm. We could see a really big breakout war as a result of cyber actions. But the reality, at least from my point of view, is more banal. What we're really seeing is the rise of cyber espionage and crime, not necessarily cyber war, where we see cyber used early and often during military conflicts. So if that's true, the reality of cyber conflict is more limited, then we are left with an interesting question of how states of the G7 should address cybersecurity policy. So an obvious answer to this is to counter the rise of digital espionage and crime by government and non-state actors. That's where, in my opinion, we should focus, is on espionage and crime. So this reality of cyber espionage suggests an urgent need for more rules in cyberspace. We all know about China. We all know about what China does to U.S. Private and government networks alike. So our goal should be to rethink how we store critical information. Before we blame everything on China, we need to look here at ourselves and our own networks first, and to see if we can defend ourselves better. One aspect would be the need for basic cyber hygiene. I call it cyber hygiene is how humans behave on networks. There's a lot of issues in government and the private sector on training employees how to behave when they're at work. The OPM directors claim that the system is a hackers' dream. Basically, a lot of it, yes, China got into the OPM networks, but a lot of it was our own fault by not being very, very well protected. So some strides, as my colleagues have addressed today, have been made in norm creation. Behind these developing norms is the accepted international norm. And this is something that you see across domains of conflict, of limiting harm to civilians. And civilians are the main targets in a lot of these cyber espionage and cyber crime techniques. So the optimum status of critical infrastructure fits this normative construct because the main impact of such an attack would be borne by civilians. So this needs to be built into this normative idea. So to reinforce the norm of what we might call cyber safety, states have to be willing to make investments in really kind of getting down to best practices for cyber hygiene, internal training on how to deal with potential threats from the human perspective, a reformulation of the critical infrastructure that runs important systems. Basically, the Ukrainian power grid was ran on a Siemens system that basically took one command at a time. So all you need to do is give that 2 commands, and you successfully brought it down. So we need to rethink on how we build these things. And definitely greater cooperation between the public and private sectors. I think that's played out in the Apple FBI issue that the public and private sector perhaps don't get along all the time. So some proposed action plans that I've been asked to present to you today are number one is cooperate with the UNESCO UCLA Chair in Global Learning and Global Citizenship Education and deploy an application for practicing the Ethics Code of Conduct for cyber peace and cybersecurity that were kind of brought up through this forum. Also build up a cybersecurity center in Nha Trang, Vietnam, I hope I pronounced that right, to support for cybersecurity in Southeast Asia as a pilot project in supporting developing countries in their cybersecurity challenges. So developing countries need to build the networks that they need and build them safely. And finally, we need to frame cyber conflict better. I think using the term cyber war is not constructive. You need to move the discourse away from war. War denotes death, and that puts certain images in people's mind. I think we need to really kind of work on how we frame this domain of conflict. Like I said, promote cyber hygiene, really promote how humans behave. And another issue is to regulate the cybersecurity industry. Right now, at least here in the United States, there's really no regulation on how the claims these industries make. Cybersecurity firms can claim that they do something even though they can't. So they must be clear about their abilities and promises, just as any industry must be. That you really must be able to do what you say you can do. So that's my 2 cents on this issue, and I thanks for your time, Governor.
Thank you. Now the final participant in this segment of our conference, the Consul General of Japan here in Boston. Tommy, go on.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Michael, and Tuan, and everybody else. Thank you very much for the great inputs and wonderful preparations. On behalf of the Japanese government, who has a privilege and pleasure of hosting this year's G7 leaders meeting, this is particularly a rewarding opportunity. So thank you very much. I will not go into details about the policy recommendations because much has been already discussed. I'd just like to highlight, or maybe repeating some of the things that have already been mentioned, that this issue of cyber security is paramountly important. We look at it, simply put, from 2 perspectives. Of course, the security side, but also that is also important because we see immense opportunity that a cyber space and cyber technology produces. So in galvanizing economies, innovation, as well as spreading human rights, we value the open and free access to information. All the more we believe in the collective efforts of securing the cyberspace are critical. So I thank you, we thank you very much. A couple of things to repeat is that as the chair of our Liberal Democratic Party's policy committee is that I mentioned, the issue has been already taken up in the preparations of the G7 leaders meeting. At the foreign ministers meeting, there was one paragraph in the communique talking about cyberspace. There are references to the same issue from different perspectives in the G7 energy ministers meeting and G7 ICT ministers meeting. So we are engaged in the process of preparing, together with the other G7 leaders, for a very useful and important outcome at the G7 Ise-Shima summit toward the end of May. What will be done will not stop there, and certainly should not stop there. G7 has a particularly important leadership, collective responsibility, because we share our values. But we have to go beyond the G7. And we continue to count on the Boston Global Forum in spreading the wonderful and very important work beyond G7. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Numi, very much. And on behalf of Boston Global Forum, I want to present these 2 documents to you, which include the recommendations of the forum. We hope you will transmit them to your government and to your government in the G7.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all so far for your contributions and your attention. We're now going to move to a discussion around the table. We can of this first half of our conference on this issue of cybersecurity norms, codes of conduct, the rest of it. And I invite as many of you as would like to participate in this discussion. We'll pass the microphone around and make sure that we. So, who wants to start? Thoughts or comments?
Microsoft.
Where are you? Who's on?
So, my name is Greg Palmer. I'm Microsoft Azure Infrastructure and Cybersecurity Specialist here in the Northeast. So I did not prepare anything specific to kick off, but I think that Microsoft has laid out a number of norms that I think that are very important, at least from the technology vendor's perspective, around how to deal with creating an environment so that not only that the public can feel safe, secure, and have a reasonable expectation of privacy around the data that they use in the technology, in the cloud space, in the cyber world. And I think the key thing when we talk about regulations or regulatory discussions is around the ability to move as fast as the cyber threat moves. So when we talk, that's one of the key pieces that I talk with customers day to day is in the concept of being able to respond and to react to the evolving threat. And so it's not just a static threat. We need to be able to think in terms of how we actually respond, how we bring new technologies to bear. And I think one of the last things that Microsoft has laid out is really around how we cooperate from country to country in response to these attacks or events in cyberspace. So I think these are all key components as we think about developing norms or developing the ways we work together. These are very important that we create a structure that we can respond rapidly to the situation.
Are you folks involved actively in this effort internationally?
So yes, there's a number of, we've got a specific thing that you may have seen specifically advertised on television is around our digital crimes unit. So the digital crimes unit is one of the things that Microsoft engages in that really is focused on identifying threats and then essentially taking down the command and control centers that these type of threat actors put up, and that's how they essentially move around within networks. So that is one of the key things that we always rely on local authorities and the individual countries to cooperate and participate with us when we're trying to take down a threat actor.
Hello? Hello?
In the last meeting,
who is
I think from Tokyo, something. I am retired from Yale University and advising Mr. Shinzo Abe, but not in political matters and in economic matters. I mentioned the security when I think last September, I bought an Oriental in the market. 1 week later, the credit card was used by somebody in Brooklyn, New York market. But as I say, I think securities and terrorists, all those matters are in the case of the prisoners. If one side raises aggressive in stealing information and so on, then the other should start escalating, and both countries or the whole world goes into very low performing. Look at tourists in the airport. Of course, terrorists are genuinely able in killing others, but all the resources used to check the luggage and so forth are wasteful, and that's because of conflicting behavior. And in order to resolve this kind of dilemma, we have to have some rules or laws by negotiating laws, we have to make those activities controlled. But unless countries do not have mutual trust in each other, it is very difficult. So cyber security is to be in hand to hand with the actual mutual trust in the world economy. Finally, I'd like to mention one thing. In order to protect this kind of stealing activities, we need lots of difficult things. For example, if I use as my password Hamako, H-A-M-A, Koichi Hamada, Hamako, that's very simple. But those used in Japanese governments are very long. I can never put the password without copying the wrong thing and so forth. So all of the resources are used very, very inefficiently in this mind. And I think that more and more formality and strictness would not be the direction. We should have to find some easier secret, lower level secrets to be in a little easier one. So I don't want to get into the US presidential elections, but I feel like as Secretary of State might be tempted to use his or her own telephone or so instead of usually over strict tight controls of passwords and procedures. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there's a question coming.
Or
sir, can you turn on the microphone, please?
Can I turn on the microphone? Can I turn on the microphone? Oh.
Can anyone hear me?
Okay.
All right. Thank you. I have been invited to give my own personal position, not that of the U.S. I work on the U.S. government with my grandmother. So maybe I want to just react a little bit to the comments that were made today. I want to point out, start with a good comment that Joe made about the states will run and consider self-interest. I've been listening to conversations about drones for at least 5 or more years, and what we know now is that the westernized states, the costs are 1 to 2% of your national GDP. If that doesn't constitute a national self-interest, what does? And so we have to ask the question, there's a lot of good thinking and good ideas going on. Why is it that we don't see the kinds of reactions that we should see if these norms were to be operative? Part of the problem is this is the first time in the history of the westernized democracies that the key technology they're trying to have a norm about is not within their control. And because it is not within their control, we have a large IT capital goods industry that's been making decisions on their own business model, and now the governments are in a position in which they have to defend flaws in those business models. This is not open question, it's just simply the way it is. So now how do we go forward with norms that are hard to impose? We are missing third and fourth order thinking here. Most of the norms are given as a list as a should, and we should think about it, isn't this wonderful? I would like to just suggest three things that have been suggested by several of our speakers already. Process, institutions, and audience. We don't tend to identify a process by which the norms will be enforced or will come to enforcement. We say we hope, we wish. Secondly, the institutions, as already been mentioned, let's use some of the institutions that exist, but we cannot necessarily use global institutions. Scale is too big, and we don't share enough common values. And finally, the audience. This is the G7, not the G20, not the G400. This is the G7. So this is the best audience we're going to get that have a common sense of rule of law and common values. So under those circumstances, I highly recommend, part of our recommendations are that we think sub-regionally. We think binding. And we think binding on the major players, not just governments, but also on major corporate actors who, standing with the governments, could make these norms a reality rather than something other people simply avoid. And the final point I want to make about that is that it is unlikely in the future, that is the centers of economic and demographic power move to the east, it is unlikely we will have much of a better chance in the future. So if we're going to start talking about sub-regional agreements that are binding, this is in fact the best time to do it. Thank you.
And I hope, folks, we can get into that. How do we do this? Now, politicians want to know how you do it. And the norms are interesting. Okay, how are we going to enforce them? Who's going to do it? Under what circumstances? And I think it's time we begin to talk about that very seriously. As Chris points out, having those norms up there is fine. How are we going to make it happen? And I'm not sure this is so complex that it doesn't lend itself to strong international action. I mean, argue we have all kinds of problems with nuclear energy, but we've got something at least close to an international regime of enforcement. And I don't see conceptually why we can't be thinking about the same kind of thing when it comes to cyber. Let's at least see if we can explore that. Okay. Now, I think, trying to follow our schedule here, I think we have Professor Matthew Smith on film. Oh, you're here.
I'm here.
Well,
Phil didn't work that well, so I thought I'd just come here.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Matthew Smith. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Bonn in Germany. My research field is the human aspect of IT security. So I'm interested in anything where the human is involved, and looking particularly at their failings and how the technology can adapt to our needs and not try and have the human adapt to technology's needs. But actually, before I go to that, actually pick up a point Chris just made, that we need to figure out how these things we're recommending are enforceable or doable. And from a technical perspective, I think some of them might actually be impossible. So if you look at page 4, item 3, says here that countries should exercise restraint in developing cyber weapons and should ensure that any which are developed are limited, precise, and not reusable. I think that won't work. No matter how much we would like that, I think cyber weapons are inherently reusable. They're also inherently repurposable. So this might be something where we're expecting the unachievable, at least to the best of our current knowledge. So that's a quick follow-up from what Chris said earlier. On a more general note, my feeling of the room is that most of the people here are very much on the defense side, saying we should be creating these norms to create more security, to create a system in which we have a secure cyber infrastructure. I think that's very good. But one way of actually getting that to happen, I think, is to be more inclusive of the offensive side. So the people who are working against us here are on our side to a certain extent. The security agencies of the different countries involved here are also the ones calling for the backdoors, are creating cyber weapons. I mean, just last week we read that the US is now dropping cyber bombs on IS. And these people are our allies in a sense, and we should be talking with them and have them in the process, because I think the more we grow apart, the less likely it is that these norms will work. They'll just be working within the system and saying, well, we have 1,000 lawyers to figure out how we can fulfill these norms, but still fulfill our mission goal of spying, of espionage, of attacking other resources which they want to attack. And I think just on the technical side, we will not be able to enforce that without both sides working together. That's why I call for more cooperation on that. I have to take out one last point, which was raised about cyber hygiene. I think that's also an important issue, and I'm sure that was included in that, but I'd like to make it more explicit. I think we shouldn't just be talking about the end user here, the people working in governments having secure passwords, but actually looking at the actors who have the most impact, who are also humans. So when we create systems, they are not secure. Every piece of software has bugs which can be exploited, and these create entry points into bigger networks, which then can create a lot of damage. And they're created by humans who are programming code. So, for instance, the shell shock and heartbeat bugs, which caused an awful lot of damage fairly recently, those were single developers who made a small mistake, and half the internet was affected by that. We need to create systems by which these humans are supporting creating secure systems. And maybe this should be something which we actually put in here as well, that the G7 commits to a joint research program in how to even create secure systems. Before we can get to the state of saying things don't happen, we should be having a two-pronged approach here, trying to create systems which are safe from the get-go, and in the meantime, please don't develop systems which aren't safe.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a question. Cyber bonds, is that what you were talking about?
That's how they termed it. I wouldn't use the same term.
Explain this to an ignorant guy. What happened?
I would say that was a catch-all term for offensive operations in the cyber realm. So I think they included activities such as attacking chat servers where IS was operating. They broke into systems with financial records of the IS operations and doxed people who were interested in IS. So suddenly it's no longer, you can't join anonymously, your name will be public. Maybe creating a higher threshold of people wanting or fearing for people to enter that system. Just showing your systems are not secure, we will find you, I think was kind of the main goal there. And they termed all those activities cyber bombs.
Steve Wall.
Just throw it. Thanks very much. This is not really my area of expertise. I teach international affairs
Kennedy School. But one of the assignments I gave my class this term was in fact how you would go about promoting a norm for dealing with cybersecurity. So I invented a little norm that was based in part on this, and then the task for them was to develop a strategy for how you would promote it and sell it worldwide. And one of the things that quickly became clear in the class discussion in the assignment as they did it was the gray area problem. How do you resolve the places where it's ambiguous what would constitute actually a violation of the norm? So we quickly decided that civilian infrastructure would be something you want to isolate, much as the principles developed here are. But then the question is, what exactly is a civilian facility? And what are the possible gray areas in that? So just to give you a couple. What about a port facility that both brings in food and fuel for the civilians, but also is used for military purposes, to refuel ships, to reload ammunition? If you staged a cyber attack on that particular facility, have you violated the norm or not? Or even better, it says here in the norms that you're not supposed to engage in the unlawful taking of the assets or confidential information of private individuals and organizations. Is Lockheed Martin a private organization? If someone hacks into the computers of Lockheed Martin to steal plans for the F-35, is that a violation of this? It's a private corporation. Or if I'm a consultant who works for the Central Intelligence Agency a couple of days of the year, and someone hacks into my computer to get at whatever it was I was writing to the CIA, have they violated this particular norm? What's interesting here is, again, we just have to resolve some of these ambiguities, and in some cases, global organizations have developed procedures for doing this. So the World Trade Organization has a dispute resolution mechanism that when there's a disagreement over whether or not the set of norms embodied in the WTO have been violated, countries can take another country to the dispute resolution mechanism, and it actually works remarkably well. What so far is missing in this realm is any mechanism for dealing with those potentially ambiguous cases where one country genuinely believes it has been wrong, and the observing the letter, maybe even thinks it's been observing the spirit of the norm as well. I raise all of this because selling this as a global norm depends in part on whether or not states or other parties believe it's going to be enforceable, and whether they believe it's going to be possible to resolve disputes over whether or not a violation has occurred. Thanks.
So, Steve, what kind of enforcement mechanism?
Now you're getting beyond my area of expertise.
You're a very creative guy. Tell us, what kind of enforcement?
I think you would eventually have to have some kind of objective arbitration panels that would be seen as, above the fray. It's the same way we try to resolve other disputes in international law, which sometimes works remarkably well, and in other cases, we may be getting to this later today, like the South China Sea, it hasn't worked particularly well yet. But there are, at least procedurally, institutions we have. The question is whether or not we can apply it in this particular realm. I actually think it's going to be harder in this realm for reasons that have already been mentioned, namely the enormous number of independent actors that will be operating in this area.
But it is going to require a tribunal or tribunals, is it not?
Something like that, that's right.
We haven't, this isn't the first time we've seen that, and we've got some models.
And the real challenge, of course, is making this something that will stick when relations between countries start to deteriorate. Right? So getting an agreement that sort of regulates conduct among states that are basically on friendly terms, and occasionally they'll bump into each other and sort of say, excuse me, I won't do it again. That's relatively easy. It's how you deal with the situations where the relations are deteriorating and the temptation to skate closer to the line goes up.
Okay, Margarita.
Okay, thank you. This is not really my area of expertise. I do research and information marketing mainly, but in my research, I meet a lot of, my area of research is focusing on a completely different set of values. And that is where I would second you, Chris, in keeping it regional, in keeping it in the G7. For example, on page 3, the point on assisting other nations to investigate cybercrimes. The country I do research just basically made commercial for its cybercrime on national TV. Well, on Sputnik, they said in an article that the cybercrime is giving out guarantees and extending business hours. So it's a whole different set of values. They might sign it, they might say they want to adhere it, but they will not. Now, from my perspective, if you want to create norms, I do agree, start small, make it binding within countries that would share the same values.
Okay, any further comments about this?
Yes, I have a point. The problem is not countries that share common values. I think the problem is all the others that maybe don't share the common values that the world group does. And if it's true that we're dealing with a global phenomenon where lots of other actors can intervene individually or collectively, I think it's going to be important to at least address the global aspect, not just countries with similar values. Or maybe it's a special matter.
Any other comments? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Llewellyn King. I wonder whether we're not somehow missing what's actually happening here. We're looking at essentially establishing or something close to an international regime, largely in the hopes that it will be honored or possibly down the road with some sanctions attached. Yet if you look at the large recent attacks that have drawn a lot of attention, a lot of alarm, they were nearly all non-state actors. I would say Ukraine was a state actor, probably. Panama, the law firm, not a state actor. The release of all of the open documents and there was a concept of political action. It was not a state actor. And then primarily you have things like the attack on Target and attacks every day on commercial databases, which are non-state. These are criminal acts. So you must look at the origination of these, and they tend to be commercial, sometimes nationalistic, which our regime would take care of, or at least seek to take care of. And there are those that are political and sometimes even social in their motivation. It looks to me as though we're trying to put a set of rules into a guerrilla war, a difficult number.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, which is why the defensive side of these norms is so interesting. Because if we can get more resources working collaboratively to defend ourselves, we can make a dent in those non-state actors' activities. But currently, the state actors are actually weakening our position because we are still investing so much in defensive technologies. And those are then used and piggybacked upon by other actors as well. So trying to get the norms to maybe get people to work together would be a first step in the right direction there.
Good. Okay. Now we're going to turn to the second part of our conference here, and it's going to focus on Japan and the G7 summit. Ambassador Fujisaki is
from Tokyo. I was the G7 Sherpa about 10 years ago, and we were criticized that every year we are doing something very similar. The communique was almost identical. It was very difficult to see which one was which. However, this is because I understood that it was annual health checkup. Try to see if our democracy, market free market mechanism were working. And it was really useful for that. However, from 5 years ago, it changed because three things occurred 5 years ago. One, Middle East, which seemed to be very slowly moving, suddenly started to move with Arab Spring, and now we see so many terrorism as well as refugees. Second, EU seemed to be success story, has met some challenges. Maybe it is still success story, but we need it to be success story, but having many challenges like Brexit as well today. Third, because of our accident and disaster, nuclear energy has become not only a champion of the environment, but has some problems as well. So three changes have occurred just 5 years ago. And in this 5 years ago, 5 new issues have arisen. One, pandemic, like Ebola Zika. Second, economic issues, discrepancy between haves and have-nots. Third, rule of law issue, South China Sea. Fourth, slowing down of developing countries, emerging developing countries. And lastly, new issues like cyber. And Japan, I think, in this Ise-Shima Summit will cope with two important issues. One, to restore world economy and try to put the economy onto the right track again and try to have global health issue, infrastructure, and all that in that regard. Second is this new issues like cyber and space. These are the two, I think, important issues I foresee in this G7 summit. As for cyber, I think this initiative has been very helpful because, as has been said, United Nations and our other experts who have working, I think our effort will add to that. The important thing is that it's an invisible challenge, so that it has to remain as gentleman agreement. But if all of us are committed to keep those gentlemen's agreement, we can identify easily who is contradicting, who is not really abiding by to the gentleman's agreement. So I think it is still useful, although we cannot see, to try to make all this, and I think Ise-Shima Summit, I hope, will contribute to that. Now I'd like to pass on to Ambassador Yanai. Thank you very much. I really hope that this will be a successful meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fujisaki. My name is Yanai. I'm former ambassador of Japan to the United States, and now I am a judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg. I will one, cyber security. Second, peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region. Third, the rule of law on the seas and oceans. First, cyber security. As you know, the G7 ministers in charge of information and communications met in Takamatsu City, Japan, at the end of last month. And they expressed strong opposition to the use of information and communications technology for terrorism and crime. And they agreed to promote the development of technologies for analyzing and identifying cyber risks. And I'm sure the Ise-Shima G7 summit will take further actions on this question. I'm a layman in the cyber issues, but personally, I would like to suggest the following action. First, to establish international rules or norms governing activities in cyberspace. As you know, unlike in land, maritime, and outer spaces, there are no established international rules in cyberspace. Second, to agree to promote technologies to counter cyber attacks by states and non-state aggressors. Third, to create or strengthen specialized cyber defense units within the armed forces and other government agencies. Fourth, to encourage the private sector to increase the awareness of cyber risks and to enhance resilience against cyber attacks. And finally, to promote cooperation among the G7 member states and other like-minded countries. Now I'd like to turn to peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region. We are living in a very difficult and severe security environment, especially in East Asia. China is building up its armed forces and modernizing them, and they project powers on the Pacific Ocean. And North Korea has been repeating nuclear testings and launching missiles. And they are improving their technologies in nuclear weapons and vehicles carrying nuclear weapons. So against this background, the Abe administration proposed to the Diet, to Parliament, to adopt a series of amendments to the existing laws concerning security, peace and security in Japan, and enacted also a new law concerning the participation of Japan in international peace activities. The advisory panel on reconstruction of the legal basis for security proposed that if interpreted correctly, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution permits not only the exercise of the right of individual self-defense, but also the exercise of the right of collective self-defense, and it allows Japan's participation in collective security measures under the United Nations. So based on the on such recommendation, the Abe government and its coalition partner, the Komeito, proposed a series of amendments to existing laws concerning peace and security. And especially they adopted the change of interpretation of Article 9 to allow Japan to exercise the right of collective self-defense when its ally is attacked by a foreign country. So this is a new development in the legal framework of Japan's security system. And so finally, I would like to touch upon the rule of law on the seas and oceans. The G7 countries have been expressing strong opposition to any attempt to assert territorial or maritime claims through the use of intimidation, coercion, or force. They call on all states to pursue the peaceful management or settlement of maritime disputes in accordance with international law, including through internationally recognized legal dispute settlement mechanisms, and to fully implement any decisions rendered by the relevant courts and tribunals which are binding on them. In the case of the South China Sea conflict, the Philippines brought the case to the arbitral tribunal established under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But unfortunately, China does not appear in the tribunal. This procedure is a compulsory procedure under the Law of the Sea Convention. But China does not comply with this obligation. But this arbitral tribunal continues its work, and I understand that they will deliver an arbitral award sometime next month. So I'm very concerned about the non-appearance of China in this peaceful settlement procedure, because the non-appearance of one of the parties would jeopardize the sound management of peaceful settlement of this dispute. Thank you very much.
That was a very Ezra.
I'm Ezra. I'm Ezra.
Organized specialized in China and Japan. For our friends from Tokyo, all of whom are good friends of mine, Ambassadors Fujisaki and Yanai, and Ambassadors Kakibara and Hamada, for taking the trouble to take part in our discussion. I thought what I can do as somebody who doesn't specialize in cybersecurity is say a little bit about the context of holding it in Japan this time, what it means to Japan and what Japan means to the world in this. And secondly, to say a word about the two elephants in the room, China and North Korea, who will not be at the meeting. In terms of what it means for Japan, Japan has a special moral position. It's the only country that has been bombed with a nuclear bomb, and it's the only major economy in the world that has chosen not to develop the nuclear weapon. And I think this gives it special moral position and authority to work on important international issues. Secondly, I think that there's a strong commitment of Japanese leaders who realize they're not the first economy in the world. Japan is not number one, and China has passed it, and perhaps India may pass it someday. But they have a special role in promoting peace and health and international norms. And I think that's a position that many Japanese leaders want to take part in. And I think taking the initiative for this summit at that time in Japan is a good opportunity for them to recognize and concentrate, and for the rest of the world to recognize their special role. Thirdly, holding at Issei has a special meaning, because Issei is seen as the original, it's a renewal of the shrine of the original founding of Japan. If you have to say, where did Japan come from, what's the history, it's at Issei. And every 20 years they have a renewal of building the main shrine at Issei, which goes way back in the history, way back before they set up Nara and Kyoto. And so this, in a way, it's a symbol of the soul of Japan is being held there, and they're welcoming the world to Japan to play a special role. The two elephants in the room, this is a personal opinion, and perhaps many people don't share it with me. But I believe in the long run, we have to recognize that North Korea is now a nuclear power. We have failed to prevent them from becoming a nuclear power, and now we have to deal with that unfortunate fact. And as I think about the future of it, they've been a terrible regime. They've been unreliable. They've not been truthful. But the fact is, they're now nuclear power, and there's a danger they could pass the weapons on to a non-state actor, which is perhaps even more scary because they know that if they use it, they're going to be completely destroyed as a nation. So I think there will be some reserve in using it themselves. And I think we have to begin to think a long-term different game than with North Korea, one that we have not wanted to face. And that is to think what it's going to take for them to be a successful nation. And I think this is going to mean turning to the economy. And my own hunch from what I hear from my North Korea specialist friends is that now that they have made it the breakthrough to become a nuclear power, they're going to concentrate on the economy because it's in terrible shape. And in thinking about the economy, they don't want to just open up. We say, well, why not just open up? That will show them. They're afraid that if they do, South Korean business will come in, foreign business, and just overwhelm their economy. They're just a little place. So we have to think creatively about ways that their economy can begin to grow and begin to have slow range of contact with the outside world. And with China, they have their view of history and we have our view. And I think there's no question that they aim to be a major power in the world. And we're now having good discussions with with Chinese leaders, and they're meeting Obama and going to international meetings. And I think their statements and their contribution on issues like international environment issues have been a real contribution. But the unfortunate fact is that we don't have trustful relations with China. They think we're trying to contain them and prevent them. And we are. We are. Yeah. And we have to begin to work toward a deeper understanding with China that recognizes their increased power and that begins to work with them realistically and accepting certain things that they are doing and moving into islands which they claim we have a historical basis for, and we don't have international rules that have been decisive in resolving those issues. We're going to have to put those issues aside and develop a long-range vision, not in any single agreement, but as a continuous working system so that we recognize their growing power. And they recognize that we're going to be a power to stay and that the rest of the world will continue to have an interest that they will be able to damage what we do in the Pacific, and we will be able to damage what they can do, and we have to come to terms and work with each other. And we have to have that in mind as we carry on our negotiations at the summit in Japan. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Let me ask you just one question before we go to Steve, and we're running out of time here. China has more leverage on North Korea than any other country, right?
Yes.
Don't the Japanese understand that?
Yes.
So why the Japanese kind of mixing it up with the Chinese when, in point of fact, the great concern is North Korea at this point? I mean,
well,
what is going on?
The Chinese they're concerned that they're going to be a neighbor of North Korea forever. The United States is a long distance away, but they're across the border.
Yeah.
And they don't want chaos. And they're very disappointed that North Korea has behaved so badly and become nuclear, and they're putting pressure, but they don't want the regime to collapse. They think the chaos that would result and the chaos on the Korean Peninsula would be much worse. And so I think no matter what we say to the Chinese or the Japanese say, they're not going to let North Korea collapse. I think that's the reality.
But what about some leverage on this nuclear stuff?
I think the Chinese have tried to apply some leverage and it has not worked. and they're not willing to go for more leverage because it might be the collapse of the regime, and they think chaos would be much worse than the situation that exists now.
Do they have any leverage over anything to the Chinese?
Oh yes, the Chinese have considerable leverage. They supply food, they supply fuel to North Korea, and they're not stopping that. They have contacts with North Korea, and they're not stopping those. So they've used a lot of their leverage. They're disappointed with North Korea, but they're not going to go all the way. And
Steve? Comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to highlight what I think are the two big dilemmas, and maybe I'll talk about what I think is the third elephant in the room here. To me, the central dilemma in Asia right now is how do you deal with the gradual increasing Chinese power and assertiveness? And the emphasis there is gradual. When a country does something sudden and dramatic, like the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, the international community can respond very quickly, very vigorously. When something happens really slowly, like the reclamation of a reef in the South China Sea, at what point do you decide that, all right, that's the last shovelful of sand, not one more shovelful? There's no obvious point. It's a sort of classic salami tactics. Now, the United States has started to do more to indicate that we don't accept those territorial claims, but that won't work if it's just the United States sending heavily armed warships. Other states are going to have to do that too, and it's going to have to be other than just warships, because the principle is freedom of navigation, not just freedom of navigation for the U.S. Navy. Second, and here's the third elephant, how does the United States reassure its various friends in Asia, and how does it coordinate security partnerships in that part of the world without being taken advantage of? And here are the only two words I want to emphasize are Donald Trump. Right? It's not sustainable, I think, over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years for the United States to be spending 4% or so of GDP on national security and have all of its Asian partners be spending less than 2%. It's not going to be sustainable. A Pew poll from last month said that 57% of the American people wanted the United States to mind its own business and let the rest of the world do the best it could. Right? And it's quite a shocking result. 47% thought the United States was doing too much in the world. Only 27% thought the United States was doing too little. And that's part of what's fueling Donald Trump's political career right now. So if you think about security in Asia, you have to think about how the United States will retain a leading role there, but without the American people thinking the United States is being taken advantage of. And this is not going to be an easy one to resolve.
So what's the answer to that?
There isn't. I believe the United States is going to have to push its partners in Asia much harder than it has in the past.
To do what?
To make a much larger contribution to East Asian security and stop depending on the United States to do it all for them.
Any thoughts about all of this? Got a few minutes before we wrap up. I'm kind of troubled by that. Not troubled by what you said, but kind of troubled by what it portends.
Well, the other thing I would add is that this is going to require much more sophisticated and adroit diplomatic attention in Asia. The United States is going to have to spend a lot more time managing those relationships than it has in the past. That also involves building up our capacity, more expertise, more people who know those places, more people who know the languages. In other words, the so-called pivot to Asia is not just reallocating some military forces, it's also reallocating time, attention, diplomatic expertise. Right? It's going to have to be a shift, and I hate to say this for my European friends, but it's probably going to mean relatively less attention to some other parts of the world. Because there's only 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week.
Any other thoughts on this? We've got just a few minutes before we...
Hello. May we have a talk from Japan?
Okay, we have a very few minutes.
Is that all right? Can I talk?
How many needs them?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I will talk about this ISMA summit. This ISMA summit has come at a very critical juncture of the world economy. During the course of the last decade or so, the world economy has gone through a major structural change. Most of the G7 countries has achieved high living standard of 40 to 50 US dollars, and their growth rate has now come down to around 1%, and inflation rate has come down to 1%. So the key word for the G7 countries at this moment is probably the maturity. So that at the ISMA summit, what we should really talk about is not the enhancement of the growth, as was the case in the last in the last summits, but we should talk about what this maturity means for the developed world, developed part of the world: Europe, United States, and Japan. Of course, U.S. is one country which never matures, but even U.S. growth rate has come down from 4 or 5% to 2%. So that what this maturity means for developed part of the world is, I think, should be the key topics of discussion at this ISMA summit. Thank you very much.
Comments before we wrap up? Nobody?
There are some questions from online. They send email.
What have we got?
Yes, here. Very much a question here. They send to us. Yes. Very about more than 10 questions. I select here.
Hold on.
Up to you. Up to you. Chairman, you can decide as many questions up to you to choose or not. No problem. Send my email and they follow up.
This is a little beyond my comprehension. I was the guy with the last typewriter. I was going to campus before my kids finally said, "Dad, you got to do something." Anyway, here's a comment from one of our participants out there. We have seen multiple nations transition to infrastructures built with free, open source, and encrypted hardware, software, and spectrum. Open data policies are also being adopted. How many countries can we get to support this excellent trend? I'm not sure I understand what that means. Who understands what it means?
Please.
Somebody? Anybody?
I think the individual is very well-meaning and optimistic and naive.
And naive. Because?
Well, what we've seen is the growth of borders in cyberspace. We're talking about wherever you have open data policies, if you don't have the kinds of norms and controls that we've spoken of, what we see is the rapid removal of wealth in ways that cannot be traced admirably under known legal systems. So my heart is with them. My head says let's have some other conversations.
Okay, how about this one? How do we balance illegal and legal surveillance?
Firstly, we need more transparency to actually know what's happening. So I mean, currently we can't balance what we can't see.
There's somebody from Princeton who asked about the cost of cybersecurity for developing countries. Is that something we ought to be concerned about?
Yes, and we should be, because one of the big applications of cyber in the developing countries is online banking, is cyber mobile banking. This means that your cell phone company is now your bank. And if you trust them to be more secure than the banks of the world, you've got a problem coming. Up to 50% of the people who bank in Kenya today do it on cell phones. Actually, I think it's higher than that. And up to 50% of the desktop computers in Kenya are absolutely compromised. Somebody who takes down one of these major cell phone companies in Africa, for example, are going to majorly affect those developing countries. Absolutely, we should care.
One. Anything else before we wrap up?
Yes, I think now good 9 p.m., nearly 9 p.m. already. So Chairman can decide. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
thank you all very much. Obviously, we got something here that deserves attention, and a lot of it. I'd like to think, with the help of so many of you, we've made a contribution. Let's see what happens on the 26th and the 27th of May, and then let's just keep moving along. As some of you know, I mean, our focus and our goal in creating the Boston Global Forum was to focus on a particular issue for 1 year and really get into it. And I think we've been able to do that fairly successfully. We're going to have additional meetings and conferences between now and the end of the year, and let's see how much impact we have going forward. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you from Japan.
Thank
you from Japan.